you need to understand the sensitive issues of collaboration between patient organizations and all the different stakeholders, from industry over HTA, academia, regulators, and all the different parties involved in the medicine's development process. And I'm delighted to introduce you in this webinar into different perspectives, and we have a very high-level panel on that with 2 patient advocates and 1 speaker from industry looking at different perspectives on it. First of all, I'd like you to raise questions because we have 3 presentations in the beginning, and please don't hold your question. You can also type them into the Q&A window, which I'm going to monitor during the presentations, and I'm going to raise some of the questions later on to the speakers when all 3 have presented. So with that being said, I'd like to start off, and I would like to introduce David Harry. David Harry is going to speak about EUPATI guidances for interaction between patient organizations and other stakeholders in medicine's development. David is patients' rights activist. He has been active on a broad range of HIV-related issues, including drug development, regulatory issues, biomedical prevention research, travel and residence restrictions for people with HIV and AIDS, risk communication, and doctor-patient communication. He's also co-chairing the Patient Consumer Working Party, PCWP, at the European Medicines Agency, and he's also active at Swissmedic. So, David, welcome to this webinar, and thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours now.
Thanks, Jan. Can you hear me well?
Not very clear, David.
Very clear, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jan, for the kind introduction. We are going briefly work coming out in the coming months on EUPATI guidances for interaction between patient organizations and the other stakeholders in medicine's development. Doesn't move. There's terrible background noise, which is very disturbing. Okay. Perhaps people should be on mute. Why do we need guidances for patient involvement and interaction? During the EUPATI courses and interactions with the trainees, the question came often up, and even among the consortium members, how actually can we make it happen? How actually can we be involved? How actually can we do it? And the guidances should give us indications on which topics patient organizations and the patients can interact with other stakeholders in a meaningful way. And the overarching guidances on meaningful and ethical interaction is missing in many areas, which causes this insecurity that is prevailing everywhere. We have existing codes and regulations, but they hold mostly legal and ethical content, and the specific content to cover the patient involvement in research and drug development is actually missing, and the language in these guidances or in the codes should be much more directive towards the patient involvement, and it should tell much more about it should be done and less about what should not be done, which is currently the focus of the codes of practice. And there should be a clear default statement that collaboration is allowed unless expressly forbidden. The scope and objective of the guidance development is to develop a framework and guidance and principles for interaction and involvement of patient representatives and individual patients to increase the involvement in all phases of research and development, covering 4 areas: industry, ethics committees, health technology assessment bodies, and regulators. And it should examine processes for engagement and the methods of linking individuals to these opportunities. We also want to explore opportunities to collaborate with external stakeholders and generate more dialogue and raise awareness on this topic and the EUPATI training course. Regarding the guidance on industry-led medicines research and development, what I can say here is that the existing codes of practice do not cover patient involvement in the R&D in what is happening before drug approval. So clear and robust guidance is most needed in this area, and bearing in mind that currently not everybody is ready for a meaningful interaction on this topic. The guidance will be very generic, and any disease-specific detail will be excluded from the guidance. We have a short list of 6 existing codes identified as important foundations. We reviewed to define the sections and the content for this guidance, and we performed an additional literature search. We have identified specific instances of interactions to explore the synergies on how to create roles for patients in a systematic way, and identified case studies about the successful involvement of patients and patient organizations. The guidance will share best practice where patient involvement works well already today, like in HIV and rare diseases and certain cancers, to generate greater interest and break down perceived barriers in areas where it's not happening yet. There is reference to external supporting documents, activities, and opportunities. And we define a value proposition of the EUPATI certificate for pharmaceutical companies involving patients in all aspects of industry-led R&D. The ethics committees is built on a roundtable we held in September 2014 and a webinar which was held in March 2015. The area of interaction with ethics committees is a rather challenging area because the ethics committees are under national and regional jurisdiction, and the legislative differences across Europe are quite large, and in most regulations patients are not even mentioned. The new clinical trials regulation gives us some but not enough leverage to define a clear process. So far we can say that we have different opportunities for patients to be involved in ethics committee processes as external reviewer, general advisor, and regular ethics committee members, and the key areas for providing patient input are assessing study risk, burden, and benefit, informed consent documents, and lay summaries. What we need to clarify are the prerequisites and criteria for patients joining committees, and there will very likely be recommendations for changes in legislation in the future. On HTA bodies, we have a well-documented area here, however, only a few implemented examples to draw on, and again, national jurisdiction prevailing. In 2010, a survey was performed, and the survey showed that 52% of the responding agencies already involve patients in the process, 22% provide trainings, and 19% evaluate involvement. The barriers for better involvement are well known. They consist of time, cost, resistance from members and staff, and the concern about the bias that patients could bring in. And the biggest single issue is capacity building on the patient side. We have not identified a single model to build on. We need case studies for better input, and ISPOR is very proactive in this area. There is an EC, an European Commission's Collaborative Committee on HTA with EuroDis and the European Patients Forum participating, and ESPOR and UNET HTA sources we are using in the guidance. Regulatory authorities, finally, we have a very mature framework to draw on from the European Medicines Agency, which is easily adaptable at national level, and efforts in different countries already ongoing. The dialogue with the patients started at EMA actually 20 years ago with the HIV patients. EMA has a patients working group since 2003 and formally established the Patient and Consumer Working Party in 2006. The interaction has a legal basis since 2004 in an EC regulation. The interaction covers areas of common interests with very clearly defined objectives to facilitate participation in benefit-risk evaluation, ensuring that patients and consumers and their organizations are listened to and involved in developing plans and policies, enhance the understanding of within the EU regulatory network development, evaluation, monitoring and provision of information on medicines, and optimize communication tools to support their role in the safe and rational use of medicines. I think we can skip that one. Yeah, we can skip that one. We had a EuroMeeting guidance, EuroMeeting DIA guidances session in April, where we presented the plans, and we got very good feedback at the session back then. We are now finalizing the content within the consortium internally, and we will have a consortium review going on in the next 2 months, and a public review going on from probably March 2016 that will last a couple of months, where external parties will be able to provide feedback to the guidances. I think that's the end of my presentation. Dimitris will now, we will change the slides for you, Dimitris, because it's complicated.
Okay.
Over to Dimitris, and Dimitris needs to be introduced by somebody who will do that. Young guys will do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And I think you've shown important work of the EUPATI consortium in terms of guidances to interact with different stakeholders, because we always confronted as patient advocates to have codes here and there. But when we were analyzing that, we were clearly seeing that there are so many gaps and there's so much unclarity about this. So I think the guidance will help a lot. So from, let's say, going from guidance to practice, our next speaker is Dimitrios Athanasiou from the Duchenne community. He's going to speak about patient interactions between industry, HTA, academia, and regulators, stating the Duchenne muscular dystrophy model. And I'd like to introduce him because he's got more than 25 years of experience with international business, but he's also a patient advocate since 2011 because his son was actually diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and he's been self-teaching all the issues around rare diseases and advocacy and so on through the summer schools and patient experts course, and he's one of our trainees actually on the first EUPATI course, and I had the pleasure to meet him twice at our face-to-face meetings. He's got a tremendous lot of knowledge about all the different advocacy issues, and I'm very glad to introduce him to you now. So Dimitrios, stage is yours on your presentation.
Thank you very much, Ian, for the wonderful opportunity. David, thank you also very much for the very, very useful presentation. I would like, first of all, to say that Duchenne is a rare disease, so having this in mind, you can understand what we're facing with interactions with our other stakeholders in the medical development. The areas basically that we saw when we started our active participation, it was, first of all, in the past, there were some gray areas in patient organization relationship with the industry, and that created, obviously, some complexity in the environment, lack of trust, and obviously delayed drug development, especially for very quick developing diseases. That was a very big minus. On the other hand, almost all the other stakeholders had a very clear code of conduct and compliance regulations. You can see that there are many of them, like EMAS, FPAs, EuroMeeting, and many other more. So we thought that, first of all, we need to have a professional approach and a specific frame of contact with the other stakeholders. And obviously, we needed some compliance and legal advice on how to do it good. And I'm expecting that EUPATI is doing to do the best on that. The fourth point is that there is very very big need for a directive towards patient involvement in every environment. This can only be achieved in an organized and transparent environment, and we have to make sure that we provide and every other stakeholder will play along, let's say, and create this environment. Patient organizations need to have a very you have to go a little more back. Patient organizations have to have a very clear position when we are in medical development equation. We have to be clear about our interests, our positioning in all the process, and find effective ways to tackle possible challenges in the equation with the other stakeholders. Next one, please. The limitations that we're facing are obviously the limitations that everybody has in our audience today. We have a lack of knowledge and skilled patient experts. EUPATI is working very hard on that, and also EuroMeeting is working very hard on that. But basically, at the end, it's up to the patient advocates how we train ourselves. The lack of transparency and the common code of conduct is something that it's obviously giving a lot of trouble to patient advocates in order to do our jobs properly. Limitation of the current models for rare and ultra-rare diseases, because there aren't many advocates. If you have half of the population, for example, with a disease, it's much easier, but if you are having, I don't know, 100 patients in Europe, then how many advocates can you find and how many can involve in every aspect of advocacy? Limitations we have, because we usually look in the small image, we have to understand the bigger image, how we fit in this image, and how we can develop a long-term strategy. As far as for the Duchenne muscular dystrophy, most of you, I hope, know that it is a devastating genetic disease. It affects boys. It's a rare disease. There is no drug at the moment. There is no treatment, and life expectancy of our boys is about 20s, late 20s and early 30s. The strategy we develop in order to tackle these obstacles in DMD is that we formed an umbrella organization some years ago, and we try to use the benefits that we can get from each of our participants. First of all, we started by mapping the environment and identify the specific areas where we have strategic interest. For us, for example, is academic research, the relations with the industry, regulatory work, training, venture capital and funding for our research is a very important issue. After we identify the key stakeholders per area, we put specific goals on how to develop these relations and how we can move forward. Define which of our patient organizations in this community are more effective for each area, because, for example, our Netherlands organization is very good in research, UK organization is in funding, and, for example, for us in Greece, we are very good in regulatory work. So we develop in which areas we are the best, and we don't double and triple our efforts. We have developed new organizations internationally, and we integrate them because this is going to be a constant stream of high-skilled patient advocates. We develop specific working groups that have a specific group leader, and we, how you can say it, we import new patient organization representatives in order to train them in this process and to develop more advocates. We identify highly skilled personnel in our patient advocates, because some of us, for example, are good in finance, but others are having medical expertise. And we try to create, let's say, pockets of knowledge that we can distribute between each other. We manage possible conflicts by developing alternative skilled patient advocates per area, because the same person that has, let's say, very close relationship with the industry, it's going to be maybe viewed as an individual with an interest, so it will not participate easily in other work, for example, regulatory work. We distribute knowledge and best practices under all our umbrella organization, so we all improve together. Some examples that we have, for example, with other stakeholders. At the moment, I can give you some examples with the industry how we work. We have many risk-benefit studies that we work for DMD. For example, the last one was a study regarding pulmonary therapies with one company, Santhera, and the parent project in US, in order to develop a new, let's say, risk-benefit endpoints that can use for regulatory work and to see if the drugs are working. We have the decoding to SEN. It was launched from our US partner, because most of outside the EU countries don't have genetic testing, and that was a big collaboration with many of the industry players, and we managed to have a free genetic testing, interpretation, and counseling to all our kids. Also, we try to share this. We create some focal points globally in order for other areas and other countries to have access to this free testing, and we're working currently on that. Last week, we had our first PAG, which is a patient advocacy group, an advisory board with a company, looking on the challenges and solutions for DMD, best practices, and how we can transfer knowledge. We work, of course, very closely with HTAs, although we don't have many drugs at the market at the moment. We have some candidates, and we have to know very well how the system works. We have a nice accreditation for our guidelines, our Duchenne guidelines, that it is produced with the highest standards, and everybody can accept this in, let's say, the process of DMD. And in real life, we exchange them, let's say, with expertise, and at the same time, we take some advice from them in pharmacoeconomics that obviously is not our strong point. With academia, where our start is treat NMD. It started many years ago as a neuromuscular disease registry network, and at the moment is one of the biggest project leaders in the US and in Europe. It started to create some registries and some tools for industry, clinicians, and scientists in order to develop new therapeutic approaches. We having at the moment working on databases, post-marketing registries, and other projects. We have been very well connected with Connect. Basically, it's a hub of databases, biobanks, and bioinformatics. That's very important for rare diseases. We work for DMD imaging with new technologies. We develop new technologies for MRIs and MRS in order, first of all, to assess our disease on the skeletal muscle, and obviously to develop some new biomarkers for our DMD therapeutic developments. An example that it was very useful and very big learning curve for us was our Dutch partner in Holland. The PPMD there worked together with the University of Leiden, and they developed a new exon skipping technology that can be used also in other diseases. And one of the most, let's say, advanced and hopeful for us is the exon skeleton project that we're running, that we try to use new technology in order to assist our boys to keep, let's say, our patient mobility movement to develop. The latest work we have done last week, it was a meeting, for example, in EMA. We're trying to have some guidelines about our patient registries and how we can create our post-marketing registries. We have developed with both the agencies draft guidelines for Duchenne, so all the other stakeholders can know what's important for the patient organizations, and the clinical developments are based on these ones. But in order to have an idea of how solid and how difficult this work is, for example, in the US, they had about 80 representatives that were participating in 7 working groups, and they were working for 6 months in these guidelines. It was very important, and we used that also to assess it and to validate it with EMA. One point that's very interesting is the points of interest for our regulatory authorities. For example, the consulting, the strategic advisory work, and like participation in steering committees and advisory boards, with or without remuneration, but together also the patient organization funding should be declared in every activity that you do with the regulators. And last but not least is the future. We have developing new models and new strategies for the future. Since we don't have a lot of drugs on the market, we are working with other patient organizations. We are building research consortiums, cross-disease consortiums, patient-owned registries, post-marketing registries, which are validated, post-patient reported outcomes in order to facilitate for our clinical trials. And of course, this is something that needs a lot of work, a lot of resources, and a lot of commitment to develop it, but it produces a lot of results. New models on drug development financing. Since we belong in a rare disease, we're looking at philanthropic venture capitals, we're looking in hedge funds, crowdfunding, and other tools that we can use. We start working on a model for non-pharmas and non-profit CROs in order to have drug repositioning, and we're currently working on a DMD mapping project with a non-profit pharma, and but the important thing in this is that you have to know that the data is owned from patient organizations, which is very important. And the last thing that we're working is the IP ownership, intellectual property. Because of our Dutch organization, we had IPs over the exon skipping technology, a small percentage, but still it shows how the patient organizations can get involved and own the IPs. And also we are very close, and we work very close with the owner of our DMD model. It's a mouse with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and it's very useful for us for our clinical trials. This is the things I want to tell you. I'm very happy to share with you in private whatever you need and whatever we can help you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dimitrios, for your very interesting presentation. It's really impressive what the Duchenne community and you have achieved with all the different stakeholders in academia and regulatory and industry and so on. That's great. I have a couple of questions to you, which I'm going to keep until the very end, because we have one more speaker, which is Stefan Dedinius from UCB Biopharma. He's going to talk about patient involvement prior to regulatory scientific advice. Stefan is a pharmacist by training, and he has worked in global regulatory affairs in various pharmaceutical companies over the past 20 years, including MSD, J&J, and currently at UCB Biopharma, where he's responsible for the regulatory strategies and development of new medicines. He has a broad global experience of drug development across different disease areas with a strong interest in patient involvement and development process. So Stefan, tell us about patient involvement prior to regulatory scientific advice. We're curious what you're going to tell us.
Thank you very much, Jan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. There we go.
Good, thank you. So thank you for the opportunity to speak at this webinar. And first of all, I want to say that what David and Dimitrios has presented already is very impressive, and is also the basis for a lot of things that we do in terms of patient involvement across the medicines development process. And what I will talk about today is really just one example of that. It's one of many, and one, let's say, case study of how we can do this and how industry and patient organizations and individual patients can collaborate. So what I will talk about is a case study around scientific advice with the EMA, and what we did prior to that, primarily to inform the scientific advice process and how we best could move this product forward for development. So before I start with the case study, for the audience, I also want to talk about a little bit how we think about scientific advice and what it is in the regulatory space. So as a company, and what you have on the slide here is a very high-level description and a slightly simplified description of how this works, but I think it's important to go through that so that we have a clear view. So a company, as in our research and development, we look at the potential medicine products that can potentially treat a specific disease, and that comes out of our labs. And once we have looked at this and we have a potential candidate for a disease, we start preparing our development plan from a clinical perspective, from a non-clinical perspective, and also from a chemistry and from manufacturing. And this is all based on regulatory guidance. Dimitrios in his talk talked about the guidance that is being developed for the FDA and the EMA in terms of DMD. Which is one example of a guidance, but there are many other guidances that we follow. We look at precedents, how other products have been developed in the same space, and we also take input from physicians that have expertise in this area, from patients and other stakeholders, such as health technology assessment bodies as well as payers. What we then get to when we look at the regulatory strategy and how we interact with regulators during the development process is that we review, is our plan largely in line with the available regulatory guidelines and precedents? Does that mean that we have a path of development that has been used before, or are we, for example, proposing that we would use a new endpoint for our new clinical endpoint for our development? Or are we using the same endpoint that others have used? That's just one example. And the way we think about this is that if the plan is largely in line with available regulatory guidelines and precedents, then we typically will not always necessarily seek scientific advice with the regulators, but we will do it for large phase transitions. For example, when we move from our dose-ranging studies into the confirmatory pivotal phase 3 studies. If we are proposing something new, like a new endpoint that has not been used before, we would definitely seek scientific advice, and then we, based on the scientific advice and all the other input that we have received, we initiate the development plan taking this into account. So that's just a very high-level view of the process. So if you go to the next slide, Eladia, please. So the case I will very briefly present to you today, and I'll be open to questions afterwards as well, is that it's a case where we looked at a disease that currently has very few existing treatment options, and it's an autoimmune disease. In this specific autoimmune disease, there are other concomitant autoimmune diseases that are very common. So patients, we know from literature and from talking to patients, have many different diseases potentially to cope with. Currently, this specific autoimmune disease is only treated symptomatically, meaning that we can not really treat the cause of the disease, and there is no systemic treatment available. So what we did here, and it was a new therapeutic area that we were starting to engage in, a disease that we as a company have not been active in before, was that we had an advisory board jointly with clinical experts in the field, so physicians who treat these patients on a regular basis, and also with patients from either individual patients with the disease or patient organizations. And we did this advisory board prior to seeking the regulatory scientific advice. And the scientific advice was focused on a new potential systemic treatment that we have in our pipeline that could address this disease in an immunological fashion rather than symptomatic. So go to the next slide, please. So when we went into this advisory board, of course, we wanted to ask specific questions and have a discussion. And the questions that we put primarily to the patients, out of many, but these were two of the key questions, was, as I said, there was a disease that has many other concomitant autoimmune diseases potentially, and how do we address the prevalence of these concomitant diseases versus the disease we're treating, and which disease is most important to treat first? Is it this primary autoimmune disease, or are there other concomitant diseases? What we learned and what we took forward into our scientific advice from as key outcomes from this advisory board was that, first of all, patients are using a lot of different medicines already, so polypharmacy, due to these concomitant diseases. Whereas when we do development in this immunological disease or other immunological diseases, typically we would start in patients that have only one disease, because that is how we typically look at it, and we learned that that would be very difficult in this particular area. So what this helped us to do in terms of our input that we could provide then for the scientific advice request to regulators, what was that we already, when we submitted our questions to the regulators and to the EMA, in our background documentation, we could also already include this kind of more detail in terms of the patient input. And I believe that this provided a better basis for the advice that we subsequently got from the EMA. So we go to the next slide, please. So very briefly, the conclusions from this is that what we do see is that patient input at a very early stage, before the initiation of any clinical development and before we submit scientific advice requests to the EMA, is of great importance. And I personally believe that that is very, it informs and makes better plans, the scientific advice process, before it actually starts. It definitely will give context to the reality of the disease, and specifically in areas where there's very little precedence, where there's no regulatory guidance, where there is little clinical guidance as well. And it helps us as a company and also as regulators to address patient needs while still meeting the regulatory requirements that we need to meet for developing new products. And as I said in the beginning, this is just one example of many in the medicines development process where patients can collaborate together with us as companies, together with regulators, or with other stakeholders in the process. So I'll stop there, Ilaria, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. This has been very conclusive, and I think, let's say, your perspective on getting patients involved at a very early stage is very encouraging, and thank you for this. So we've had three very different and very interesting presentations. I'd like to now open the floor to questions, and I've actually noted a couple of questions which I'd like to raise to the different speakers. The first is actually is to Dimitris, because he mentioned in his presentation that they identified in DMD and Duchenne highly skilled patient advocates and trained them. I'd like to hear some more details about how did you train up and how did you identify patient advocates that could actually engage on this very, let's say, complex level. How did you do that?
Basically, we try to identify, we map down whatever, let's say, organizations we had across Europe. Then the next step is to find out in constant communication who, for example, is their patient expert in research, or who is doing the fundraising, or who is doing something else that our other organizations don't have the expertise. As long as we manage, for example, to find out that we have a patient expert who is very good in research and following up the research in Italy, then we share his knowledge and we use him, let's say, train our patient advocates that we have in Spain or in Greece or in France. And like that, we can try to transfer the knowledge down, because some of our patients have 25 years experience in this field, and some of our patients just got a diagnosis. So that means they have 2 years or 1 month or 6 months. And according to maybe what is his previous profession, we can find out who is better, let's say, to fit, and of course, if he's willing, to help globally in this, let's say, effort. Because if, for example, for me, it's more difficult that I'm coming from business to understand the research, at least it was in the beginning, than a medical professional. And if he's also having a child that he's advocating for 20 years on this disease, obviously he has a lot of experience to share with me, or with regulatory work, or with HTA, or with other fields.
So that basically means that you need to know about your advocates, not only what, let's say, their history is and what their interest in the disease is, but what their professional background is to actually involve them and identify the right people. Is this correct?
Basically, that you have to map your strong points, who are the strongest people in your community. But it doesn't mean that you have to find them only in your border. You use your umbrella organization to identify them, even not globally, at least regionally, and then try to train others for that.
And I'd like to raise the same question actually to David Harry, because the HIV community, or European AIDS Treatment Group, has had a long track record in, let's say, identifying people, engaging advocates, building them, training them, and then engaging them in all the different forms with all the different stakeholders. So what's your experience, David, on this?
Thank you, Jan. We have to perhaps look at different kinds of interactions and different kinds of requests. For example, there is for many years an established protocol review group, and this protocol review group would review protocols from industry as they are submitted to us to review, which has to happen within 3-4 days. So turnaround is very quickly, and the way we do this, we have 3-4 people going over a protocol, somebody moderating their input and coming up with a joint feedback to the company from this review team. And in the review team we have experienced people, but we also train people on the job on performing the reviews. What we need to have in these teams is statistical know-how, and know-how about research ethics, and know-how about trial conduct and study endpoints, etc. Then we have the issue of data safety and monitoring boards. We often appoint people to these bodies from our organization, and when we were first confronted with such a request, we had to train people to make that happen, because these people need thorough know-how on statistics. So there is now a group of 4 or 5 people whom we can safely appoint to the SMBs anytime. There are a few more that are close to get there with their know-how. I think that's 2 examples how it can practically work. Then we know from several people that they have skills in specific areas. So when an issue comes up, a question comes up in a certain area, they will shout over email, that's my opinion, or this is my opinion, and most times they agree and sometimes they disagree and have to come to an agreement somehow. If an issue is controversial, we use a face-to-face meeting to discuss it out within the scientific working group.
Thank you very much, David. There's one question that came up in Dimitri's presentations, and I know it's a very hot topic for you, David, as well, and it's also touched by our industry speaker, which is the issue of conflicts of interest, which I think is very connected to the guidance that we are also developing in some way. I mean, Dimitris had it in his presentation that actually you probably need to split or have 2 advocates, one working with the investigators and the regulators and so on, one working with industry, and probably not the same person working with both. So I'd like to actually raise that question to all 3 speakers, probably starting with David. How do you manage conflicts of interest in your advocacy work, and how do you see this whole topic evolving?
It's a poisonous question, but I'm happy to reply to that. Actually, for me personally, and also for our organization, conflict of interest doesn't really exist. It is something use a term under which you describe certain things. And what is often described as being a conflict of interest is, for example, funding of the organization. And if a company is funding the European AIDS Treatment Group, that doesn't do anything for me as an individual. They may fund the organization, they may fund certain activities of the organization, but I have little practical benefit from that other than that I can travel to attend the meeting, and that's it. But what I invest into the meeting is my free time. So what is being funded by some third party is matched by the time and my know-how I give to the meeting and to the organization. And where I could see much more of a real conflict is when, for example, I would be in a situation where I have to advise a regulator in a scientific advice group meeting on a drug, an intervention, or a study which is coming from a company that is funding my organization, and I know, or I may know, that advice I'm giving is either having a positive or an extremely negative impact on that company. So I might be biased, or I might simply take the freedom and not be biased. And I think if somebody takes his job seriously and his work seriously, he will always be bound and have public health interest in his mind and not be taken by short-visioned interests. At least I have seen my colleagues so far in the EATG being very free in voicing their opinion, even if it has been against the direct financial interests of a company funding us. And I think the proof of the pudding lies in the eating, and the fears are currently going beyond what I see happening in practice. But that's the experience I have, and that's the view I have, and other people might have a different opinion.
Thank you so much, David. I'd like to turn this question actually to Stefan, because I mean, that's a crucial question for you as well, in terms of not only conflict of interest, but where are patients best involved in development, with a company or with a regulatory level, or with both? So what's your perspective on this? Thank you, Jan.
I think that David gave a very good summary, I think, of the let's say, the conflict that may exist. My view, to your point, Jan, is that I do believe that the earlier the better. The earlier the patient involvement, the better, because that gives us, let's say, it makes us not lose time in terms of gaining access to medicines for patients. And at the same time, I do acknowledge that we may be in situations where the patients that are involved, or that have the knowledge, or have the let's say, that are involved in various patient organizations, may be called upon both by, let's say, companies and regulators and others. But I think my personal view, and I have to say that this is very much my personal view, is that as long as it is transparent, in terms of, and the transparency is there in terms of the advice that has been given throughout the process, with which stakeholders, etc. I think that, to David's point as well, and I hope I'm summarizing your point well, David, is that it is a process where everyone is professional and providing their views in the context that is being asked, and then there are rules, of course, that we have to live with and that we have to abide to. But I think the earlier the better. That's my simple answer, Jan, to that.
Just one follow-up question to that. I'm not sure to which one probably is, in which scenarios would collaboration be expressly forbidden? That's a question that came in from Joanne. Do you see, does any one of the three of you see a scenario where collaboration should be forbidden? Well, David first, maybe?
There is national legislation in some countries where interaction between industry and patient organizations is sort of regulated, or is on a little bit a bumpy road. Spain is such an example. In Germany, there is some legislation that could be used or can be used, and I know a few cases to hinder collaboration. I have just learned about an established conference where patients participated that was running into troubles because of that, because somebody complained, and the investigator running this conference had to make a deposit of 50,000 euros. He got out of it in the end, but it was a very tricky situation. The problem with such legislation is that it is often subject of interpretation, and it can be misread, because the patients I know who have attended this meeting, the meeting I'm talking of, are very educated ones, and they would have been really pissed off if they couldn't have gone there anymore. So perhaps we should also work on a better public understanding what is actually happening if patients are attending scientific conferences, or if patients are exchanging ideas and thoughts and have an established interaction with other stakeholders. And perhaps they need to be very transparent about what they are doing there, and why they think this interaction is of value. And this should be in the public domain. I also think that a lot of suspicion can be prevented if on the patient side the organizations are open on where their funding is coming from, and they should be open about that on their website, and should make sure that the funding is not coming from a single company, but from several companies working in their disease area. So there are a couple of simple things one can do as a patient organization in order to be safe from unfounded attacks on themselves.
Just picking up on this, Stefan, do you have any perspective on the, let's say, no-go areas or areas where collaboration is not allowed from your perspective?
Well, we do have, and similar to what David is saying, there is of course the rules that apply either to patients or physicians or others who are active in the working parties of the EMA, or similarly at the FDA and advisory committees, for example, on the US side. And that is something that we have to respect, but it can prove difficult at times to specifically find the expertise that we're looking for with those prohibitions in place. But that's something that we have to abide to, of course. But that is more for the individuals, as David alludes to, when it comes to interaction with the EMA, for example, and being an expert with EMA, whether a patient or physician. There is the obligation to disclose any other interactions that one has had, and we do the same. We should do the same whenever we have regulatory interactions with the regulatory authorities in terms of how we have gotten or the advice that we have received from patients, for example. So I don't see any no-go areas, but of course there are certain rules that we have to live with and abide to.
Do you have any perspective on this?
The perspective we have, at least in the DMDs, mostly there are, let's say, two areas of interest. The one is the personal interest that you might have as a patient advocate, and obviously we use the regulator as a rule of thumb, the regulator's interests, in order to coordinate our activities. We definitely, when we are in doubt, contact them and ask for advice, which is always really protective for your advocacy. And as for the non-go, I think if you are looking to the funding of the organizations, I think basically if you have one organization that all the incoming finance is coming from one partner, industry partner, then obviously it doesn't look good. And if you have restricted funding, at least this is how we usually operate on that.
Thank you, Dimitros. I'd like to move to actually a bit of a different topic, because it basically came from Sue, who actually said that many industry partners are probably fearful of making direct contact to patients, or there might be compliance issues where it might be just difficult to address to patients. And at the same time, we have very educated people in Duchenne, in HIV, in all the different disease areas, like we've heard from the two speakers. And we have, for example, now the 50 plus another 60 patient advocates which are on the EUPATI course, which have a tremendous expertise. And there's a gap, and quite often when we discuss this issue, we saw a lot of, let's say, perceived barriers, how we can actually match these knowledgeable patients with the ones that actually need advice from these patient or patient advocates. So I'd like to actually pass this on to Stefan, because Sue asked about this. Do you think there's a role of EUPATI or of other entities to actually match these kind of knowledgeable patients and patient advocates with people in industry?
I think that we've seen that EUPATI and other organizations definitely play a role in this, and being a, let's say, I don't know what to call it, Jan, but a matchmaker to a certain extent. This is my personal view. But I think there is a role there, and I think what EUPATI is doing in terms of the educational part, as well as the webinar that we're doing today, and the future plans, is very helpful for building awareness and for also providing a landscape and a culture in all the interactions between the stakeholders that will enable us to, I think personally, make better medicines for the future. And that is, of course, a very visionary goal, but I think that with all stakeholders involved at the right level and at the right time, I think we can do better than we do today. It's my personal view. as a whole, with all the stakeholders, not just as an industry.
Can I probably pass this question also to David, because as he's been working so heavily on the guidance that EUPATI develops at the moment with the whole team in Work Package 7. So can guidance, let's say, enhance or facilitate the process of getting patients involved with regulators and with industry and so on, and overcome these, let's say, perceived barriers and these kind of problems, and also that we're not matching the right people, that actually the right advice happens and that we're getting better therapies for patients?
I think the guidances can help, and that's actually why they are being written down. And what we often see as being a barrier is what I would summarize under the buzzword system readiness. People are not ready on every on all sides. I mean, patient organizations are not ready because they don't know where to start. Industry is not ready because they don't know how to do it in a meaningful way. Regulators might not be ready because they don't know where to start and how to do it in the long run. An HTA body might have fears to start an interaction and have to be convinced. So these barriers, we have to work on these barriers, and I think the guidances are a first step to identify the potential and the practical areas where an exchange is possible and how it should happen in the long run. That's the goal of the guidances, and then we can, once we have the guidances, we can work on removing the existing barriers.
Thank you very much, David. So probably passing it back to you. So what we understand now how important the guidance is and how helpful it will be, but what were the challenges from your perspective to develop guidance like this? I mean, if you're working on this for a year or even longer, 2 years, how difficult? Well, much longer, he says. So what were the challenges in getting where we are today?
I can tell you where actually the work started. We had a question coming up from a patient representative at the Patient and Consumer Working Party at the EMA. And this colleague of mine was not sure if something he was asked by a company who was funding his organization, if this was a wise thing to do or not. And what he was asked to do was to speak at the launch of a drug, of a new drug, in his indication. And we had quite a discussion of this question and thought it would be useful for the people at the EMA, for the organizations at the EMA, to work on a document where good and bad practice would be described. And the EMA said to us, that's not our business, that's your business, you have to work on that, all we can give you is a room to meet. So we spent a year developing a code of practice at the EMA, telling our colleagues what is good and what is bad. What we couldn't get into at that time was what happens before a drug is approved by the regulator, which means the pre-approval stage of drug development. We didn't have the time, we didn't have the means, but we knew we would love to come back to this once in the future, and when EUPATI was there, this is something we actually wrote into the deliverables of Work Package 7, which is why we are working on this. And we then extended it to other stakeholders because we felt that the guidance would be helpful regarding the interaction with these stakeholders too. But you see what is behind this is long work and long experience by many people involved in this area.
And I think that's a particular, let's say, value of a public-private partnership with all the different parties involved, all the different sets of experience. I'd like to pass this on to Dimitrios, actually, because Dimitrios, you've presented new model of patient involvement or new models, and gave a couple of very practical examples to that. So I'd be interested, I hope I'm not taking you by surprise, to understand how does the guidance that is being developed, or these kind of guidances, influencing these kind of models, and how will they be helpful to get where these models should be?
Basically, I think it's important to get everybody on board pretty quick. So working with the regulators, it gave us an advantage to evaluate what they think, let's say, that our industry partners should do in order to develop and to bring clinical trials that are meaningful, especially in rare diseases that you might not have, for example, enough patients to get inside. At the same time, we worked from our side, we provide them the information that what is meaningful for us. Because, for example, for me as a parent, it might be important for my child not to use a wheelchair, but for my son, it's important for him to use his iPad. So, but this information is not even me that have it. So we did, for example, research inside with our patients, with our children, to see what's important for them. And then we transfer this knowledge back to the regulators. As long as the regulators had, let's say, this knowledge, then we were working together. We could develop some guidance of what's important for the community, for the patient organization, for the drug to do. And as long as you get to this point, then you can even actually do a reverse engineering in the clinical trial or the drug development, because then the industry can identify what are the endpoints that are important for the community. The regulators can understand what are the endpoints that are important for us, and the designs of the clinical trials can even, let's say, move forward and faster towards these endpoints. That was, at least for me personally, what was the most important, because we can recognize even more what's most important for our disease, that we thought that we knew, but at the end, because we are not the patients, we didn't. And we used information from the real patients to move it forward.
Maybe just reflecting that a bit, one of the questions we also had is, do you think that the type of engagement changes with the therapy area or the type of disease? So is it very different between Duchenne and HIV and cancer, let's say?
It is obviously very different, because most of the times, if you don't have pediatric diseases, you are yourself the patient, so you have a personal experience and expectations, which at the level, as a community, you can bring together and push forward, let's say, your desires. If you are looking for pediatric disease and the actual patient, cannot give you so much feedback, at least if it's pretty young, then you have to imagine. But at the moment that you get, for example, older kids contributing to this, you have real information. So this is very important, for example, and very differentiative for other diseases. The second point is how many people you have, because for Duchenne we are a rare disease, but we're a very common, let's say, rare disease. There are other diseases that are ultra rare, and this is getting more difficult, even to present and to find what's important, but also, as coming back, let's say, to the previous point that you covered for the interest, how to find advocates that can also be a patient expert in scientific advice when you have, for example, 10 or 15 or 20 or 200 patients in EU. And then you have to have patient expertise in scientific advice. You have to have, together working with advisory, let's say, work with and consulting with the clinical trials with the industry. And the same people can also get another hat and go to HTA. This is getting very complicated, and this is an area, I think, that we need a lot of work to do.
Thank you so much. Maybe passing this on to Stefan, do you agree? Do you think that it's very different between these areas?
Yes, I do think so. From my experience, having worked in different disease areas, also in hepatitis C, for example, when the new protease inhibitors were being developed, and comparing to, for example, what I showed today, the engagement is different, but also, as Dimitrios talked about, the number of patients, the advocates, etc., is very different. And I believe also that the disease itself can be very different. But in terms of the rules of engagement, I think it should be the same. That, I think, is where EUPATI also plays a very important role in providing that overall scope, as you said, in terms of a public-private partnership as well.
maybe turning to a very practical question that actually came in from Sue. One thing that, if I switch hats and I'm myself a patient advocate, I'm confronted with so many different contracts because every company has different, let's say, legal departments, other compliance rules, and so on. And what we are hearing is that is quite a burden engaging as a patient advocate, just because you can't really take the burden of all the different regulations that every company puts out there, and this also includes the public partners and the regulators and so on. It's hugely complex. So Sue was actually asking, in the guidance for working with industry, is there a plan to develop a universal confidential disclosure agreement, so something like a template confidentiality agreement or something like that? Does this make sense, David? What's your opinion about this?
That's very much wishful thinking, I'm afraid, because the disclosure agreements that everybody has out there are either bound to internal company policies that might be directed from somewhere in the United States or from somewhere in Europe, depending on the company. In the case of EMA, it's very much directed by European legislation, and evolving legislation as well, and evolving processes, and evolving abuses or misuses or conflicts or things that just happen. Very often these disclosure agreements reflect past bad practice and then are adapted in order to avoid bad things from happening again. So I think it's wishful thinking.
So Stefan, do you agree? Is there hope for something like a universal agreement?
Jan, I could not really comment on that, but I think it would definitely help in terms of, as was proposed by the person who asked this, it would help in terms of the familiarity with the kind of confidentiality agreement that we will be setting up. So I think it's a good idea, but I'm not sure that we are there yet. So.
Okay, thank you so much. Probably, I mean, I'm aware about a project in that space at the moment that tries to do that and tries to investigate all the different contracts. So maybe this could play in a future version of the guidance as well, if there's any hope to ever implement that. Knowing that you've been on this webinar for quite a while, I actually want to pass around the last question to each of the speakers, which is more or less a look into the future or prediction. So what is your prediction? What's the major change in patient involvement in R&D next 3 years? And how will the additional guidance that we're developing, that EUPATI publishes, influence us getting there, so getting to the new way of patient involvement? So can I pass this to David first?
The major change that is going to happen at the EMA, patients will be more involved in the CHMP, the actual decision-making committee that's already in a trial phase at the moment and will progress in the coming years. That's a main development I see. And what I think is a result of EUPATI, of the project itself, and less of the guidances, is the fact that we are here and we have more trained organizations and more trained advocates out there who will be active in the future. And this has already had an impact on other stakeholders, other companies that so far haven't involved patients. Some of the regulators who have no interaction with patients but who start now opening their doors and start on something, and there I expect a lot of things happening in the coming years.
Thank you so much, David. So passing on to Stefan, what is your prediction for major change in the patient involvement in the next 3 years, and how will guidance help us getting there?
I believe that from my point of view, and I come from a certain perspective, but I do think that the earlier involvement in our medicines development process is critical for the success, and it's something that I believe will evolve further. and the EUPATI guidance, among other guidances as well, but specifically EUPATI and the way it's structured, as we talked about before, a public-private partnership, I think will help a lot in this process to guide us how we can do this in the best way.
Now, Dimitrios, last question to you. Major change in patient involvement in the next 3 years, and how will guidance help us getting there?
I think the guidance will be a very important tool, but I also believe that the most important of that is the dissemination of this information, basically to the patient experts, but after that to more grassroots, let's say, knowledge. Because if we can get it to, let's say, disseminating further, then the result can be much bigger than having 200 or 300 patient experts and using the guidance. I think it can be very useful also with our contacts with the other stakeholders, because things are changing. As David said, the regulatory view of interaction is also changing, and also the industry is changing of how it's viewing, let's say, patient organizations. But I hope that in the next 3 to 5 years, also we as patient organization is going to change how we view ourselves. I feel that the guidance will help us to be more professional and more useful to our communities.
Thank you so much. That's been very helpful. So my final question to David, actually, can you remind us when will the guidance be available?
It will be available for public consultation in March 2016.
So we're all getting very nervous now. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank everyone on the call, especially the speakers, David, Dimitrios, and Stefan, to Ilaria and to Janssen for the web conferencing system, to Ingrid Heine for all the facilitation in preparing this webinar, and thank you so much for all your questions. It's been a very interesting discussion, and see you soon at EUPATI meetings on our website, in Facebook, and so on. Please join us wherever you are. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes your conference call for today. You may now disconnect. Thank you for joining, and have a good day.